Good evening, everybody. Good evening. I'm not in any position to welcome you here because I'm a humble and grateful visitor myself. But I would love to say first how fantastic it is to see such a huge crowd of you coming this evening. It's quite beyond our expectations. So welcome to everybody, even though I'm not really the person to say welcome, but I'm most grateful for your attendance. I'm also very, very grateful to All Saints and to Jeff and to all the team here. Our little Catholic contingent has been made so extremely welcome. People couldn't have been more kind and more helpful. And I do feel that this evening is a very real churches together. And the whole thanks for this is the wonderful man on my left who's going to give us this talk this evening. Phil had talked on and off for the last 2 or 3 years to me saying, do you know, there's some really interesting bits and one of these days it would be worth, and I said yes, 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 and suddenly I thought, Phil's quite right, we must do it. And so Phil was very, very noble and has worked very hard putting together I'm sure a fascinating account of the Catholic heritage in Pocklington. I'm really looking forward to it, and Phil never disappoints. Before I allow him to start, I must of course tell you where to go when the fire breaks out. So you will have noticed there was a pretty big door as you came in, so that's a good way to get out, or else down at the far right-hand corner there's also a well-signed exit which will lead to another way out of the church. And possibly more important, if you need the loo, there's one on this floor just at that right-hand corner and one down the stairs again in the right-hand corner. At the end of Phil's talk, you are very welcome to linger, have another drink. We will be asking for a pound for your second drink, but linger and have one, help finish up the food. So over to Phil, and many, many thanks. Thank you, Phil.
Thanks very much, Rowan. That was quite eulogistic. Whether or not my wife would agree that I never disappoint is another thing. I don't normally use a microphone. Can everybody hear me at the back? Or do you? Right, if you want, Jeff has given me this machine, so hang about. What happens? Is that better? Oh dear. It doesn't really feel me hearing my echo coming back, but so be it. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here tonight. History very rarely gets lost, but it often gets buried. And Pocklington history, that is particularly true. I hope tonight I entertain you a little bit, but I hope as well you take some stuff away and I maybe start a ball rolling about Pocklington's Catholic heritage that continues to roll a bit, because there's some really special stuff that maybe ought to be better known. As I was putting this together, I had to look back through some of my stuff, and the guy on the right up there sums it all up for me. In 1989, it was the centenary of the death of William Ullathorne, and I wrote a page in the Pop Post that said, William Ullathorne, the forgotten Pocklingtonian. Hopefully, we'll, after I've told you a bit about him, that might get put to bed, but I don't think he's been discovered in the 30 odd years since I wrote him as the forgotten Pocklingtonian. As Rowan said, it was my idea to come here because I thought it actually painted the picture a little bit more. Obviously, I'm not a Catholic. I came here when I was this big. I served for several years as an altar boy down that end, and I'm still a member of the congregation here. But I know quite a lot about Pocklington history, and as I was growing up and coming to All Saints here in Pocklington, my wife was growing up and going to St John's in Beverley, and we have, I've experienced some marvellous masses around Europe, and particularly in Ireland, where her family comes from, and where we always get a serious telling off from the priest. I don't think we'd have a talk like this. I mean, he once gave us a telling off standing outside talking after the service, because he told us to get on our way home. But anyway, I've had some interesting masses around the place. This time last year I was actually in the Vatican. That was actually something else. But tonight it's about Pocklington's Catholic heritage. I hope, like I say, I entertain and maybe even inspire you a little bit. I hope I don't prompt any political movements, and it gets a bit like the Elgin Marbles, and I show you some things that you want to start taking us to court and take them home with you. I'm not a political person, I'm not a theologian either. For me, maybe my other passion is rugby as well as history. To me it's a little bit like rugby union and rugby league. We play with the same shaped ball, but it's a different game. But tonight we're here in All Saints. We obviously, until the 1530s, there was no such thing as the Church of England and the Church of Rome. There was a church. But what we'll do now is see how things went their separate ways, and hopefully some of the special bits and pieces as we go along. If anybody wants to disagree or stop me or disappear off to the loo and say hang on a couple of minutes while we get back, feel free. But we'll go as we go for now. So, and which one am I pressing? That one. The down one. Right. That's it. As I said, I very much wanted to do things here because it does enhance what we're going to talk about, and I will hop about. History is partly about buildings, it's partly about artifacts, it's a lot about people, and there are some very iconic artifacts within these four walls, but there are some major links to some special people as well. What the Reformation did in the 1530s, the Tudors, Reformers didn't like Christ on the cross. People always talk about rood screens, and Pocklington Church is very much how it would have been in 1530, except there would have been a big screen across the arch there, and Father Michael wouldn't have been stood here talking to you. He would have appeared out of that door up there and walked across the rood loft. People talk a lot about rood screens and rood lofts. They were incidentals, really. The rood was a big crucifix, and so there would have been a big crucifix in the arch there, and the screen and the loft were there for either the priest to come and talk to the congregation because they would live on the other side of that, or for people to go up and polish the screen, the cross. The Reformation tried to get rid of a lot of crosses, including the one on the left there and in the corner there, which is the Sotheby cross. Some people will have heard me say that we use the euphemism tablets of stone as something that is absolutely concretely correct. There's a tablet of stone at the back of the church there that says they found the Sotheby cross in the churchyard and it had been buried there during the Civil War. It very certainly wasn't buried in the Civil War. Churchyard crosses like that were banned as part of the Reformation. And if you kept your rood screen or your churchyard cross, you went to prison. As the Vicar of Wilberforce found out in the 1790s, he'd broken up his churchyard cross and hidden it in some bushes round the back, and when he was found he was sent to York Castle Jail for a few weeks. He said he was saving it for in case the bridge needed building, needed repairing, and they needed some stone, but they didn't believe him, and he served time for saving his churchyard cross. So certainly in Pocklington's case, it would have been buried in the 1530s, 1540s, and then was dug up in the 19th century. I only managed to get a blurred picture of the Denison triptych. We call it a triptych, but it's not really, it's a polytych. But it's not just in Pocklington where things got chipped out. Have a look afterwards. It's a phenomenal piece of carving that Robert Denison brought back from the continent around about 1800, and that again had been pulled out of a church, and he found it in a second-hand shop on the continent and brought that back to Pocklington. So all over Europe, the Reformation got rid of a lot of the trappings of its religion. I'm singing a bit, aren't I, as well, like that? Do I need to tone down a bit, or maybe I'll talk a bit loud? Anyway, I'll keep going, but have a look at that as you go along. In the corner there, under the floor, is a stone altar. I only know of about maybe 4 or 5 stone altars in the whole of the East Riding. Again, they were banned as part of the Henrician Reformation, and so Pocklington buried it under the floor. There's one in Howden, I think one in Holderness, but they're very, very rare. But it shows how Pocklington people tried to cling on to their Catholic heritage for as long as they possibly could. And if I go and stand over here, the picture on the right is the gravestone of the last prioress of Wilberforce, and it's under here. So there were 5 monasteries around Pocklington. Water was the biggest, Dunvernon was the smallest nunnery in Yorkshire. There was Wilberforce Priory, another at Thicket, and in Ellerton as well. So there are no bits left of Wilberforce Priory. Maybe a little bit of glass in the church, maybe a vessel they found in the stream. But Margaret de Easingwold was the penultimate prioress, and her gravestone ended up here in Pocklington. Some history is truth, some of it's legend. The legend was that Margaret de Easingwold and John Dolman were unrequited lovers. He was the Archdeacon of Suffolk and founded Pocklington School, and she was a prioress of Wilberforce. And the tale is that she was buried at Wilberforce, and she haunted the nuns until they dug her up and moved her to Pocklington so she could be next to her beloved John Dolman. Nice story. There's one major thing wrong with that. John Dolman was buried in St Paul's Cathedral, not the one with the big dome built by Christopher Wren, the predecessor to that burnt down in the Great Fire of London. But while he endowed and founded the school in Pocklington, he definitely doesn't lay next to Margaret de Easingwold. But talking about John Dolman, you don't have to try and read that. The Tudor monarchs were clever guys. They established the first ever civil service, and they realised that the priesthood, they were the most educated, organised, best administrators, and they came very cheap because the church paid them. And so John Dolman got all those different offices from the church, which meant it didn't cost anything for him to work for the state. There's a couple that just jump out of there, and that is that in 1510 he was a papal mandatory, and just after 1515 he was a papal judge advocate. He was a lawyer and a churchman, and the Pope obviously found him quite useful as part of that. There are various bits and pieces before the Reformation pertaining to Pocklington and the Pope. The Dean of York was the rector of this church until round about 1350. He had a manor house, which we believe is on the site of the National School on New Street. And there's a couple of references, one about an armed robbery, where a couple of armed robbers with bows and arrows went and cleaned out the Dean of York's manor house. And lots of Dean of York didn't live in York. I mean, that was very common in the medieval times and early modern times. Cardinal Wolsey, for example, was a cardinal of the Church of Rome. He was also Archbishop of York, and he never came to York. In 16 years he was Archbishop. Right near the end he got as far as Caerwyn, fell ill, and then got arrested and taken back to London. So, it wasn't surprising for people to have an important position, including being rector of Pocklington, and come nowhere near Pocklington. And by 1410, when a guy called John Prophet was made Dean of York, the manor house at Pocklington was falling down, and he wrote to the Pope saying that he had a number of manor houses around here. The only one worth saving was at Thornton, and he wanted to convert the rest, including Pocklington, into a tithe barn. That then became the Pocklington Tithe Barn for 300 years, or nearly 400 years, and ended up being bought by Admiral Duncan, who then gave the site for the National School around about 1850. But, like I say, it was because the Pope agreed to turn that from a manor house into a tithe barn that became a school. That's a drawing by a guy called Chris Rock, who's a marvellous illustrator, works at East Riding Sack Company and does odd illustrations for me, and it's taken from the chantry seal underneath of John Dolman, because he established a chantry just over there, and the school was part of the chantry. And there's a carved, it's carved on the seal of him kneeling at his desk, and that just brings him to life a little bit. John Dolman also, one of the things that I say only slightly tongue-in-cheek, but he never had to choose between his king and his God. If he had done, Pocklington School might not have existed. He was a big mate of Sir Thomas More, who did choose and lost his head because of it. John Dolman died in 1525, before the Reformation had kicked in, and so he didn't have to make that choice. One of the things he did do as the Vicar General of Winchester was he tried an early Protestant who was called a heretic, found him guilty, handed him over to the civil authorities, and he was burnt at the stake. So John Dolman didn't have that choice, but certainly he lay with the establishment, which was obviously Catholic. And then we had the big rebellion. The Pilgrimage of Grace so easily could have knocked Henry off the throne. In 2 weeks, the people of Yorkshire, by ringing the bells backwards here at All Saints, and by that what I meant is that instead of the bells going ding dong, they rang them dong ding dong ding. That meant get up your own arrow and go to the muster point, because we're at war. The people of this area put an army of 50,000 men into the field in 2 weeks, and they faced up to Henry VIII's army of 8,000 men. Henry's generals wrote back to him saying they daren't go into conflict because half their 8,000 men would have swapped sides anyway. Certainly he would have been wiped out. But the good Yorkshire folk of the Pilgrimage of Grace shook hands with Henry's generals, agreed a truce, went home, and Henry delayed, prevaricated and schemed, and 6 months later found an excuse to arrest them and executed them. That's another of Chris Rock's illustrations of the Pilgrimage of Grace bombing along the A1079 past Pocklington to go to York. They took York without a fight. They took Hull after a brief siege. At the front were, and again I say only slightly tongue-in-cheek, but the Pilgrimage of Grace united the population in a way that didn't happen again until the First World War. Usually with Tudor rebellions, the commons rebelled and the gentry and nobility put them down. With the Pilgrimage of Grace it was one in all in. So you have the clergy at the front, following behind them was Robert Ask, who was a lawyer from Orton, down the other side of Ormond-Spaldingmoor. Sir Thomas Percy, whose mother was the Lady of the Manor of Pocklington, was one of the second in command. Nicholas Rudston was from Hayton, he was a second in command, and Sir Robert Constable from Ormond-Spaldingmoor was the other big leader. And in the state papers there are examples of messages being swapped over between the different key people in Pocklington marketplace in order to keep the Pilgrimage of Grace going. So again, Pocklington was part of a great East Riding movement that was desperate to keep the old religion, the old faith as they called it. They failed. If we go over here into what's called the Dolmen Chapel now, although I think it should be the Pocklington Chapel because they built it, but the Dolmens nicked it. There's, in the top right, is the Dolmen Memorial for Thomas Dolman. Looks pretty blackened and not that inspiring, but take a look afterwards at the finer detail, and my mate Chris Rock brought it to colour and to life by doing an illustration of what is actually there on the wall. And so that's what the Dolmen Memorial really looks like. And Thomas Dolman married that lady at the back, Elizabeth Vavassor, and her coat of arms are up there underneath his. The Vavassors were Yorkshire's great Catholic family. I hope that you enjoyed a glass of wine that Rowan provided. I thought I had to get some inspiration myself, so the Vavasors legged it to New Zealand in the early 1900s and set up a vineyard. And it's a bit pricey for me, it's 12 quid from Waitrose, but that's Vavasor wine from New Zealand, and it's the same family that married Thomas Dolman and the Sotheby's up there and various other local people. As we will see, they had their main base was at Hazelwood, the other side of Tadcaster, but they also had a major manor house at Spaldington, and some Vavasors lived in Pocklington as well. Thomas Dolman was a church papist. That meant his wife was openly Catholic because she'd given all her lands to him. So the authorities, she wasn't worth arresting and punishing because she owned nothing. He came to church and actually publicly he had to, because he was a justice of the peace, and he wouldn't have been able to hold public office if he'd have declared his Catholicism, but he certainly was Catholic, and he went through the officially going to church, where his wife didn't. And like I say, he was secretly Catholic, but you don't have, I'll read that out, you don't have to read it, okay? But Thomas Dolman, the guy buried over there, one of his sons became a Jesuit priest. Of his grandchildren, 2 became nuns, and 3 of them became Jesuit priests. Of his great-grandchildren, one of his great-grandchildren became the prioress of the canonesses of the Holy Sepulchre in Liège. 2 great-grandchildren became priests, and one of his great-grandsons, in 150 years-ish later, is a Catholic martyr. He was hung, drawn and quartered during the Popish plot. And from his gravestone, those are his 5 sons. Tonight's talk, I could have done one just about the Dolmen Memorial. The normal length for what I've got to say would probably be 3 or 4 hours. You don't have to worry. My wife has already told me that there are a few people here who want to make sure they can get to the pub because it is Friday night, and Davina's looking very sheepish at that moment. So I will try and keep it to within an hour, but I could have done a talk just about the Dolmen Memorial. I could have done a talk about Pocklington's Catholic martyrs. I certainly could have done a full talk about Archbishop Ullathorne. But of these guys, Sir Robert Doleman, 2 of his daughters became nuns. He was the main fundraiser in England for the English Catholic priories on the continent. And so he just managed to keep his head above water. He was raided a few times. He lost lands in 1610 because he was a recusant, but he just managed to walk the tightrope. His brother, says Philip up there, it should be Peter, he went very respectable. He married the daughter of the Archdeacon of the East Riding, who herself was a granddaughter of the Archbishop of York. In the middle, Father John Dolman became a Jesuit priest. He just escaped with his life. He witnessed the execution of Campion, the Catholic martyr, and then he published a book about it, and it said he also retrieved one of Campion's ribs after he'd been hung, drawn and quartered. The printer of the book was put in the stocks and had his ears chopped off. Father John Dolman legged it overseas with his rib. I'm told that the rib has now found its way back to this country and is in a Catholic public school in Lancashire. That he died in France. Marmaduke in the green cloak is my favourite Dolmen. He married the widow of Christopher Langley. Christopher Langley is a Catholic martyr, and he was raided, his house in Millington was raided in 1600 because he was employing a former Catholic priest as a secretary who escaped before they raided him. He was chased many times for recusancy, which is not, people who are Catholic and don't go to church. You got heavily fined if you didn't go to church. He came up with quite a novel solution. He had a house in Pocklington, a house in Millington, another house at Duncote near Howden, and one on the south bank in Lincolnshire. And what happened was that every time they nobbled him, he said, "Oh yeah, I didn't go to church in Pocklington last week because I was in Duncote and I went to church there." And when they chased him for that, he said he was in Lincolnshire, and so he just went round and they chased him for going on 20 years without ever managing to capture him. He also put it to good use as well, in that when he was in Lincolnshire, he told the authorities he paid his taxes in Yorkshire. And when the tax man got after him in Yorkshire, he said he paid it to the man around the corner in Lincolnshire. Eventually, the tax man caught up with him, but the church authority, or the authorities trying to nail him for being Catholic didn't. William Dolman in the red cloak shows how the Dolman had quite a lot of influence. He was found guilty of manslaughter for killing a man at Burnby, and his elder brother had a word with the king, and he got a royal pardon. So Dolmans did have a lot of influence at that time. The daughters there, one of them became a constable from Everingham. One of them married into a major Catholic family up in Durham, and on the right, Anne Whittingham, she married into a Lancashire Catholic family. And two of her sons came to school at Pocklington, and on the right there you've got a diagram of the fatal Vespers, and that's still the greatest peacetime disaster in England. The Catholicism in the 1620s was illegal, but as now, the diplomats of other countries, the ambassador, had diplomatic immunity, and so the French were Catholic, and the French ambassador's residence, the authorities couldn't touch it. And so William Whittingham lived, the French ambassador lived on the bottom floor, William Whittingham and a few other Catholic priests lived on the first floor, and the top floor was used for Catholic masses. And he was actually conducting a mass on the top floor of the French ambassador's residence in Blackfriars in 1623. There were over 300 people in it, and the house simply broke in two and collapsed, and 90 people were killed, including William Whittingham. And so he's not exactly a Catholic martyr, but he died for the cause. I said the Dolmans had influence, and that's because of the Lennox factor. The Duke and Duchess of Lennox were very influential Scottish nobility. Henry VIII wanted to marry his son Edward to Mary Queen of Scots, and he got the Earl of Lennox, who was third. He was third in line to the Scottish throne to come over to England as a potential marriage broker. His wife was Henry VIII's niece, and she was fourth in line to the English throne. And they came down from Scotland. Henry gave them Temple Newson near Leeds. He gave them Wrestle Castle, because the Percys, because they'd taken part in the Pilgrimage of Grace, had lost all their lands for treason. And he also gave them Setterington up near Malton. They preferred Setterington because you could sneak in and out of the country and go to France, or bring influential people from the continent into secret coves on the coast and sneak across to Setterington. Temple Newson, even though that's where their son was born, was a bit too in the public eye. But, talking about their son, bottom left-hand corner is Lord Darnley, who married Mary Queen of Scots. They didn't succeed in brokering a marriage with Mary, and so their own son married them. And kneeling down is their son, who's James the VI of Scotland, James I of England. And the Lennoxes were very influential around here. Henry gave the manor of Pocklington to Thomas Bishop, who was the Lennox's secretary, and Thomas Dolman, and then his son Sir Robert Doleman, became the steward and agent for their Yorkshire estates. On the right is just a painting of all the major kings of Europe who were related together. So you've got Henry VIII on there, you've got the French king, you've got the Scottish king, you've got Mary Queen of Scots, and the Earl and Countess of Lennox are right in the middle there. Mary I of England initially named Mary Douglas, the Countess of Lennox, as her successor to the throne of England, and then that it got thrown out. She didn't get on very well with Elizabeth I when the Catholic regime was in ascendancy and Elizabeth was literally below stairs. The Countess of Lennox deliberately moved her rooms around so that her kitchen was above Elizabeth's bedroom, so that when the cooks went in at 5 o'clock in the morning and started clanking around and lighting the fires, they made sure that Elizabeth didn't get a good night's sleep. I think she got her own back a little bit later, including the Countess of Lennox is reputedly died because she was poisoned. But Thomas Bishop was an irascible, moralless Scottish solicitor who became the Lennox's secretary. I can't see really that he was particularly religious. He was accused of murder, of running a brothel, of all sorts of deviant. He blew with the wind. He ended up, Henry VIII gave him the manor of Pocklington, Edward gave him more land, Mary rewarded him, Elizabeth put him in the Tower of London 3 times. They reckon he kept his head because he became a double agent and was left alive in the Tower of London so that he could inform on other prisoners there. His son wasn't as lucky. The guy on the left is Thomas Bishop Jr. I didn't know that was his head until I was in the Micklegate Bar Museum a few years ago, and when the Tudors executed somebody from treason, I say they hung, drawn and quartered. What that meant is that they hung them till they were not quite dead and then cut them down, let them come around a bit, and then cut their privates off and burnt them in front of them, and then beheaded them, and then cut them into four. Their head went on one of the bars of York, and a quarter would have been sent to Pocklington and hung up in the marketplace just to remind people to toe the line. And that's what happened to Thomas Bishop Jr., because he took part in what's called the Rebellion of the Northern Earls, which was a nowhere near pilgrimage of grace that would certainly have succeeded if they'd have carried on. The Rebellion of the Northern Earls in 1569 was supposed to be replacing Elizabeth with Mary Queen of Scots, and failed miserably. Like I say, Thomas Bishop talked his way out of it. His son, who was more mainstream, he'd been to Pocklington School, he got a scholarship, a Dolman scholarship to St John's in Cambridge, and then came back to Pocklington. He lost his head. That, as far as I know, is the oldest portrait I've got of somebody from Pocklington. He certainly looks like the oldest Pocklingtonian I know. The coat of arms in the middle there is over the top of the Sotheby Memorial over here. The Sotheby's, which is the same family as the Sotheby Sale Room in London, were also a notable Catholic family, although they decided that they were better off moving more to Anglicanism. But there's some, again, we've done a full talk about all the shields around there that the Sotheby's married into, including there's a Oglesthorpe coat of arms up there. Ralph Oglesthorpe, he was the last Catholic Bishop of Carlisle. None of the other bishops or archbishops would agree to crown Elizabeth I, and he got the job of doing it. He'd been told he wasn't allowed to raise the host above the Queen, and when he did do, Elizabeth was not happy and she walked out of her own coronation. But anyway, there's a connection there in that corner. We're talking about Thomas Bishop Jr. being a Catholic martyr. The big Catholic martyr that you guys own in Pocklington is Richard Langley. He was a local gentry. He had two houses. You can still see, I think, the moated site down the end of the mile on the right at Ousthorpe. It's still there. It is not ploughed out, is it, Joe? Right. He had a classic Tudor timber-framed moated manor house down the mile just at Ousthorpe, and he also leased the main house at Grimthorpe at the top of the hill just before you drop into Gibbondale. At Grimthorpe, he didn't live there, but he established it as a Catholic mission house, and he underground added to the cellars, it is said, a quarters for Catholic priests, where in those days Catholic priests were executed as well as anybody harbouring them. And underground at Grimthorpe in 1586, the Council for the North raided Pocklington, and there were supposed to be 4 Catholic priests hidden at Grimthorpe. They found 2. 2 were not discovered, and they arrested the 2 Catholic priests and Langley, and the 2 Catholic priests subsequently escaped from prison in York, and Langley was hung, drawn, beheaded and quartered. It's said, a contemporary source said that he went to his death like a bridegroom to his wedding. I'm not quite sure. That whether that meant he was cheerful or not so cheerful, depending on how. I think I know bridegrooms on both sides of that coin. His daughter, Isabel Forster, who was probably born down the mile, she visited him in prison just before he was executed in 1586. She was pregnant at the time, and she continued to visit the Catholic prisoners in York Prison until she herself was arrested, and she died in prison. One source I've read, it gets a bit mushy because obviously the families tried to sweep some of this history under the carpet when they were not looking to get punished for their beliefs, but one source I've read said that her baby was given back out. Another said that she died with her baby, but she was certainly buried at the foot of the walls of York Castle, and so she's listed within the Catholic hierarchy as a martyr in chains. Her son became the finance minister for Charles II in exile, and he made a few quid out of that, and he founded a English Benedictine nunnery in Ghent, and his daughter became an abbess of that branch of the English Benedictines that had a sister house at Pontoise. I know a little bit about French, but you're going to hear some strange French pronunciation. I'm not particularly good. You have to tell me on a few things, David, as to how do you say Pontoise? Is that near enough at the bottom there? Pontoise, that's okay. There's more to come, David. I will rely on you a bit later. Okay, so you've got a really notable Catholic family there with a very notable, venerable Richard Langley at the top of the tree. It started getting a bit iffy. There were other major local Catholic families, and on the right there you've got the big house at Hayton. There's now a tiny little village hall and school on the site of Hayton Hall. The Rudstons, I'd already mentioned Nicholas Rudston, who was in the Pilgrimage of Grace and one of its leaders. His granddaughter became Ursula Wright, and she was the mother of Christopher and John Wright, two of the gunpowder plotters, and another of the gunpowder plotters, Thomas Percy, was married to their sister. So suddenly Pocklington is in the spotlight as a pretty dodgy place, and it's never been out of it. And the Blessed Mary Ward was Ursula Wright, née Rudston's granddaughter, and her father decided it was too dangerous to stay in one place. He'd learnt off Marmaduke Dolman, and so he moved his family around, and she spent quite a bit of time with her grandmother in Holderness, and obviously she founded the order that founded the Bar Convent in York, and is supposed to be pretty high up the queue for sainthood, I'm told. I mentioned the Vavasours. You've got several Vavasours either lived in Pocklington or married into Pocklington families. I'm just going off on a bit of a tangent, but if you've got half an hour to spare and you're driving from Pocklington to Leeds, Hazelwood Castle is just past Tadcaster. It's now an upmarket hotel and wedding venue, and on the right there is the chapel, and that is totally unique. It's the only Catholic chapel in the country that has a continuous history. The Vavasours were so well in with Elizabeth. One of her favourite lady-in-waiting was a Vavasour. One of the main generals at the time of the Armada was a Vavasour, and so she gave them a dispensation, and so they were allowed to keep their Catholic chapel. And if you go into there are a couple of skulls, and if you're a bit like that sort of thing. Down on either side of the altar are the skulls of 2 Catholic martyrs, and like I said, there is that connection back to Pocklington because Thomas Dolman married a Vavasour, his grandson married a Vavasour, one of the Sotheby's did as well. But like I say, if you're looking for something to do, just go and have a bit of a look around, or if you want a posh wedding, have it. You can have the banquet and stay in the hotel, and I think the chapel goes along as a package. That might look like Stephen Fry to you, and it might look like him playing Malvolio as a character in Shakespeare. It isn't really. That is Posthumous Holtby, who was an MP who became a bit of a Catholic witch hunter, and he was criticising the Dolmens were pretty influential in the early 1600s. At the start of the Civil War, I reckon they were knocking on the door to be one of Yorkshire's top 10 families. They had over 14,000 acres of estates across Yorkshire. At the end of the Civil War, they had about 1,000 acres left in Pocklington, and they came back to Pocklington with the tail between the legs. But in the early 1600s, Holby was after the Dolmens, and he was also very critical of the magistrates at Pocklington because they kept being very lenient or letting off the local Catholic recusants. And particularly, he took an MP called Legard to court, who was Sir Robert Doleman's brother-in-law, and accused him of trying to keep his brother-in-law out of the courts. So, but like I said, it does look a bit like Stephen Fry, doesn't it, really? I said they were living dangerously. The Dolmen of the time, in the 1680s, was arrested. Robert Doleman was put in York Castle, and he was tried for treason because he'd been fingered as a part of the Popish plot, which appears to be a spurious attempt to frame Catholics in plotting against killing Charles II, and putting his Catholic brother James on the throne. He was found not guilty. One of the Vavasours was found not guilty. That's William Ireland, his cousin, who was from the Lincolnshire branch of the Dolmens by then. His grandmother was a Dolmen. He was not so lucky, and he was hung and beheaded and quartered. And after that, the Dolmens and the constables, they were found not guilty, came out of prison, but they went into exile on the continent. They decided it was too dangerous to live in and around Pocklington. We start to move on, and into the 1700s, Catholicism was still illegal, but things had got a lot easier and turned down a lot. And what you had is that the main families, as we'll just see in a minute, had clung on to the Catholicism, were allowed to have a chapel in their house, and nobody really that far from, he didn't go out of their way to punish them for it. But while officially there was no Catholic edifice in Pocklington, I've just pulled out the parish registers for this area were maintained from 1770 onwards at Everingham, because the constables were obviously the prime Catholic family at that time. And there's a couple of examples there of, in the 1770s, there certainly wasn't a chapel in Pocklington, but there were baptisms in Pocklington. And in all probability, that's a picture of Pocklington Manor House, which is still there behind the Indian restaurant on Railway Street. And in all probability, they would just set up a room as a chapel for Mass, and had Mass and baptisms there. Going back a little bit, in the 1650s, there was a Catholic priest who was arrested on his way from Malton to Pocklington to the Dolmens. There's a few questions I struggled with the Dolmens, and one of them was Thomas Dolman, the guy buried over there, he had a house on George Street. His son, when I looked, some sources said Garraby, but that's because they couldn't read the writing. It was Gunby, and Gunby is a place just a mile south of Budworth, and that's where he moved his family to. And I couldn't quite make sense of why go from such a posh place as Pocklington to Budworth, until I went for a walk. And if you walk down the bank of the Derwent from Budworth Church, about, like I say, 3/4 of a mile down the river is Gunby, where there was another moated manor house. It's about 50 yards from the side of the Derwent, and it would have been so much safer for them to be able to get priests and other followers in and out under the cover of darkness by river than it would have been to bring people overland to Pocklington. And so it did disperse the main family at that time. I also haven't been able to find where Sir Robert Doleman was buried. Some sources say Budworth. There's nothing in Budworth Church. I've got to go and have a look at his will. He openly wrote a Catholic will, which was a dangerous thing to do. He put the cross above his will with Innis below it as well, and phrased it in a very Catholic way. But like I say, it made sense why he moved to Gunby, because he could duck and dive rather more safely. But they kept the manor house in Pocklington by then, and obviously there were some services happening at that time. The tide started to turn, that gradually various acts came into place. There was a drive, don't try and read that, but that shows that there was a letter written to the King in 1788 by the 200 most influential Catholics in Britain. And that is those 200 most influential Catholics. Again, don't try to read them, but I've just pulled that out. That's the top 50 or so. And you've got Robert Doleman Jr. and Robert Doleman of Pocklington on there. There's also on there Charles Stoughton. The Stoughtons became of Home on Spalding Moor. There's a Vavasor down there that we've already talked about. There's a Stapleton up there. The Stapletons for a long period lived at Water. W.H. Maxwell Constable from Everingham. And there's that and Thomas Langdale underneath the Dolmens. The Langdales were a major Catholic family from Houghton Hall near Sancton, and that's quite interesting to me. That I think the two Robert Dolmens are something like 46th and 47th on the list of the most influential Catholics in Britain. They were absolutely on the uppers by then. That was written in 1778. The Dolmens spent very little time in Pocklington in the 1760s even, because they owed that much money. They were getting assaulted in the street by local tradesmen, trying to get their debts back out of them. And just half a dozen years after that, Robert Doleman had become a doctor, and he was in debtor's prison in London for over a year, writing begging letters to any of his influential friends to say would they send him a few shillings to feed his wife and his son while he was in debtor's prison. So the Dolmens went from knocking on the door for being one of Yorkshire's top 10 families to being totally bankrupt. A lot of that because of their Catholicism. The Dolmens made their money by being lawyers, magistrates and landowners. If you were openly Catholic, and they had become openly Catholic by then, you weren't allowed to enter a lot of the professions, so they weren't allowed to become magistrates or judges. If you had land, you paid double tax on it. You were fined if you didn't go to church, and you also were not allowed to inherit land, and so they had to do lots of complex legal trusts and stuff, which helped them to not pay their bills, because they were chasing Robert Doleman, but he'd already didn't own his land. It was in trust to other members of the family, and so when he died, his debts went with him. But they went seriously downhill because they clung on to their Catholic beliefs. And in the late 1700s, there was a fairly remarkable immigration. On the left there, you've got Thomas Dolman, the grandson of the last Lord of the Manor of Pocklington, Dolmen. He was born in Pocklington in 1770. He'd had enough, and he emigrated to France. At the same time, the French Revolution saw a lot of the Catholic institutions closed, and so there was a major influx of Catholic priests and Catholic gentry. On the right there, that's a fictional book about Major Vigoureux, but the Vigoureaux were a Paris Catholic family who rented the Dolmen manor house when the Dolmens had disappeared off to France. And I said that we got an influx of Catholic priests from France, and the founder of the Pocklington mission in 1790 was Abbé Pierre-François Foucher. Is that about right, David? Who was the Vicar General of Aix-en-Provence. That was where he came from. That's Aix Cathedral, and on the right is the first Pocklington Catholic chapel. So I think he got a bit of a shock when he went from there. In the middle there is the interior and the cloisters of where he'd come from in France, and it's not even as big as it looks on that little diagram. That's from William Watson's 1855 map. The house on the left was still a house. On that case, it was was occupied by John Webster, I think he's still here tonight, who was a groom at the time. A few years later, a local joiner had moved in. So after the after the 1791 Catholic Emancipation Act, you were allowed to build Catholic chapels as long as they didn't look like a church. You could build a building, but it couldn't have a steeple and it couldn't have bells, and so Pocklington probably just took over a barn, and then next to that house they built something on it, and that's what it looked like. But like I say, Foucher got a bit of a shock. But the tide continued to turn, and so, like I say, that bit is your original chapel, and eventually the building you've got today was built. And why did it move from that to that? In the late 1700s, Catholicism was a posh person's religion. There was about, in 1743, there were 2 families and 1 individual were Catholic in Pocklington, 11 people in total. About that same time, there was about 1,000 people in Pocklington, probably about 700 of them were Methodist, and 200 or 300 were Anglican, and like I say, there was 11 Catholics. It started to ease up a little bit, but because of the Dolman influence being so diluted, at the same time there were 11 Catholics in Pocklington, there were 7 or 80 in Everingham and Seaton Ross, because the constables and then Maxwell constables obviously still had influence, whereas in Pocklington that influence had waned. But a few people kept it going. In the middle, if you go on the Pocklington website, pocklingtonhistory.com website, that is so marvellously maintained by Andrew over there, that is the opening of the new Roman Catholic Church at Pocklington in 1863. Why build a big church like that when you've got, you only had 11 congregation? By then the Irish had arrived. That's something I know very well. I'm from an old East Yorkshire family of shepherds and farm labourers, and in the 1840s, 1850s, hundreds of thousands of people from East and North Yorkshire emigrated to America. Of my family's generation, 60% of them went to America, and so that left a big dearth of farm labourers' jobs, and wages went up. At the same time, the Irish famines happened in the 1840s, and it's very well known about the Irish going to America and to Australia, driven out by the potato famine, but a lot came over here as well. And in the mid 1840s, 1850s, there's about 100 adult Irish came to Pocklington, and that's out of this population of still less than 2,000. And so all of those coming along, you suddenly had this Catholic congregation turns up on your doorstep, and so they built a new church. And before that had happened, you came up with this major figure in Catholic history, William Ullathorne. And I wrote this piece about the forgotten Pocklingtonian in 1889. Well, plenty of other people know about him. There's any number of portraits and photographs of him. You can see some there. On the end is one of the biographies of him. He was Vicar General of Australia. He was the Vicar Apostolic of Central England, and then he became Bishop of Birmingham, and then in retirement they made him an honorary Archbishop. What do we know about him? Well, he was an extremely good organiser. He was very persuasive and a good negotiator. We also know that he's never lost his East Riding accent. And the first time he met the Pope, when he was a charismatic 31-year-old priest, we know the Pope had some difficulty in understanding him, but thought a heck of a lot about him. And when he left, Pope Gregory, as it was, said to him, "Come back to Rome soon, and I'd like you to learn Italian." Whether it was quite as broad as saying, "Hey up your eminence, sawist," I'm not sure, but while Pope Gregory thought a lot about him, he did struggle to quite catch his accent. He is a major Catholic figure. He could have been an even bigger one. He liked to roll his sleeves up and work. He organised the church in Australia, and he negotiated with the Pope a Catholic hierarchy in Australia, and having done the organisation, he made sure he turned down the job of being the first Bishop of Sydney. He came back to England and he led the campaign against transporting convicts to Australia. There was a BBC series on a year or so back about life in a convict penal colony. That made it sound like the Ritz. Ullathorne exposed what was called the death raffles within a penal colony, where you held a raffle. If you won the raffle, you killed the person who came second, because it was seen as preferable to be arrested for murder and taken out of Devil's Island and taken to Sydney. You got 2 or 3 weeks of being well looked after before you were home. He exposed that. He came back to England and he wrote a pamphlet called The Horrors of Transportation, and he pressurised Parliament and successfully got transportation ended, and then he set on corporal punishment. They were still whipping people in Pocklington Marketplace and putting them in the stocks, and Ullathorne again fronted the movement to stop public punishment. He continued being an influential figure. That's where it all started. That's Pocklington Marketplace in about 1820. On the right there, in the middle, is Boots Chemist. And his father was a grocer, spirit dealer, sold coal and general merchant. And that's where Ullathorne was born in 1806. If you want to get a copy of one of his autobiographies or his biography, there's quite a lot in there. He only lived in Pocklington for about 10 years, but there's lots of his memories in there, including things like fishing for sticklebacks outside the Feathers, because the beck went open all the way down Union Street. He talks about being knelt at the altar in the Catholic, that first Catholic chapel in Pocklington. There wasn't a school then. Ullathorne started out being taught by Miss Plummer, who was the daughter of the curate here at All Saints, and then he was found out to the blacksmith of Burnby and boarded during the week in Burnby, and then came home on a weekend, which might account for why his accent was fairly broad. but he was particularly prolific. Judith Champ is a major Catholic writer. She called him a different kind of monk. The devil is a jackass is apparently, I think, is one of the last words he said before he died. But having established the Catholic hierarchy for Australia, he also negotiated the restoration of the English Catholic hierarchy between 1848 and 1850. And again, he was pushed forward to become the first ever Archbishop of Westminster, and managed to talk his way out of that. He put forward Wiseman as an alternative. You get some flavour of what he thought about being important, where somebody once asked him what it was like once he became a bishop, and he said, "Well, lad, you never get a bad meal again, and nobody ever talks truth to thee." And he was a delegate at the first ever Vatican Council. The Pope of the time was a very early promoter of photography, and so that's the Pope had all the delegates photographed as they went into the Vatican, and that's Ullathorne's photograph in 1869, which is quite early for portrait photography. I said the forgotten Pocklingtonian. There are roads, houses, schools, particularly in Australia, but all over Britain as well. There isn't an Ullathorne road in Pocklington. Perhaps we should do something about that. The Dolmens made a comeback. They were bankrupt and bereft in the 70s. They sold the manor of Pocklington in 1792. The year after, the major Catholic Emancipation Act, and so maybe that made it easier for them to sell their land. The main branch of the Dolmens led to France, but one of them, if you look, you might just see down at the bottom, Charles Dolman became the major Catholic publisher of the first half of the 19th century. Just about every Catholic newspaper, book, pamphlet and magazine was published by Charles Dolman. He was also the publisher and literary agent for Cardinal Wiseman, who's the guy on the left, and he was also the literary agent for Pugin, who was the great Catholic architect, and that's one of his cathedrals. He also built Houses of Parliament. Wiseman he had an interesting background. He was from an Irish family, but his dad had a business in Spain, and he was born in Spain and was sent to school in Durham, and it's reckoned that he used to stay in the holidays with John Thomas Dolman, who by then was a doctor in Micklegate in York, and so that was part of the Dolman comeback. We're getting to the end. It's 5 to 9, but I should be there in about 5 minutes. Anybody recognise that stained glass window? From the Catholic Church, yes. Anybody? Yeah, everybody's nodding. You are wrong. I was hoping you would say that. There is indeed a window a bit like that in the Catholic Church in Pocklington, and that's the bottom two bits, and the window on the right are the window in St Mary and St Joseph Pocklington. The top two and the window on the left are in St George's Church in York, which for a few years in 1850 was the Catholic Cathedral for Yorkshire. Again, massive Irish influx. They had to build a big church quick, and lots of the Irish lived around Warmgate in York, and they built St George's. And John Thomas, Catholicism's legal again, so they could marry well. The Dolmens married well in the 1500s, and then the pool of eligible heiresses got smaller and smaller through the 1700s. Catholicism becomes legal, and so John Thomas Dolman, who was the guy who restored his ancestors' memorial over there, married a young lady who was from a Oxfordshire Catholic titled family who'd been sent to the Bar Convent in York. And so his father-in-law died soon afterwards, and he inherited monies, and the Dolmens were up and running again, and he paid for the stained glass in St George's in York in 1850, and then in 1863 he paid for the stained glass in the new Catholic Church in Pocklington. And that's the main window in St George's that he paid for, and that had said how Pugin, the great architect, his cousin, had been the literary agent for Pugin. It was Pugin who John Thomas Dolman got to design the windows in St George's. I haven't been able to quite work out yet whether or not the ones in Pocklington are a Pugin design. It would be quite a notable scoop if they were. So the Dolmens were on a bit of a comeback, but we're here tonight to raise some money for the school of St Mary and St Joseph. As I said, when Ullathorne was around, there wasn't a Catholic school in Pocklington because there were so few Catholics. The influence of the constables meant that there were Catholic schools in Everingham and Seaton Ross long before there was a Catholic school in Pocklington. The influence of the Langdales at Sancton meant that there was a Catholic school in Sancton. The Stourtons, there was a Catholic school at home in Spaldingmoor. It wasn't until 1870 that you had a Catholic school here in Pocklington. There's a few photos I lifted off the History Group website or off Google there, because that's why you're here tonight, to raise a few quid for the Catholic school in Pocklington. I would hope and expect that a few of the grey-haired people around here are fresh-faced youngsters down at the bottom. There's Father Croker there, who obviously, we didn't name anything after Ullathorne, but they did name a hall after Father Croker, but then knocked it down again. He's on the one on the right at the bottom. So that's why you're here. And so just to finish off, a little bit of Catholic heritage that you can take away for the school. I talked about the constables. It gets a bit complicated because the constables married the Maxwells and became Maxwell constables, and then they died out and the Haggistons arrived, and then they took on the name of Haggiston Maxwell constables. And so, but one of the Maxwell constables ended up living on the right there. That's Teresa Lodge. There's still a bungalow on Beach Court just at the back of the school that's called Teresa Cottage. That was a major house with gardens and fields around it. and so that was bought by the Everingham Lord of the Manor, and one of his daughters moved into Pocklington, and she became the the patroness of Pocklington Catholic Church. If you go back and read on the website that newspaper report about opening the new church, then it will say about Miss Constable. When they did open that new church, William Ullathorne came back to Pocklington and preached the very first sermon there as well. But as you walk down Maxwell Road, then that is named after Teresa Maxwell Constable, who lived behind what is now the Masonic Lodge, and the school is built on their part of the grounds of what was the Teresa Maxwell Constable Lodge estate. Thank you very much.
Full of information now, fascinating, absolutely fascinating and intriguing, both the Catholic heritage but also your incredible knowledge. I mean, I'm just all... Church, a little something I want to give you.
What I will do, and Rowan, you've got to hassle me about that. I mean, I've obviously thrown masses of stuff at you. I'll make sure I've got captions that make a little bit of sense out of it.